Hello 1010 folks, and welcome to my week 5 video, part 1. And in this video I'm going to talk about the paper 2 assignment sheet, which is of course our second major paper in the class. So to follow along with me, click on content and then on major paper assignments and materials, and look for paper 2 rhetorical analysis essay. So for this paper, you will be conducting a rhetorical analysis of either Ain't I a Woman by Sojourner Truth or Salvation by Langston Hughes. And you want to choose the piece that you found to be more interesting as we're reading them together, so that your writing will be more compelling. So let's break down rhetorical analysis, okay? So remember that word rhetoric equals effective communication. And that could be through the written word, through the spoken word, through visual means, right? And remember that there are 3 appeals that writers use, or speakers, any kind of communicator would use, to appeal to an audience. And one of them is pathos, so think emotion. One of them is logos, think logic. And one of them is ethos, think ethics. That's the credibility, the reliability, the trustworthiness of the communicator, right? And so a good balance of those is important in writing to make it successful, to communicate effectively in rhetoric, right? So you're going to be thinking about how Sojourner Truth is using ethos, logos, and pathos, how Langston Hughes is using ethos, logos, and pathos. And in our discussion board activities, we'll be focusing in on all of that to be helpful to you. So you want to make sure you're engaging with that so that you understand the concepts. So here are the important dates coming up. On Tuesday, the 22nd of February, that is our idea workshop day, or week, if you will. Day that it's due is the 22nd. So you'll click on assignments and you'll look for idea workshop for paper 2. And so just as we did with paper 1, I'll be giving you some questions that will help you kind of begin to think about this paper. And certainly you can always change your mind. You're not locked into the choice that you make in the idea worksheet ever, but it's a way to begin the process of brainstorming for ideas for the paper. So you want to submit your answers to those idea worksheet questions in the assignment tab no later than 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, the 22nd of February, and then check back there. A couple of days later, I'll put out an announcement letting you guys know when I'm done, to note my comments and suggestions before you actually begin writing your rough draft, because I'll offer some guidance. And then on Monday the 28th, exactly a week later after the idea workshop day, that's the day that your rough draft of paper 2 comes due, before 11:59 p.m. on that Monday the 28th of February. So again, you'll click on the assignments tab to submit it. You'll look for rough draft of paper 2. You'll follow the instructions and submit your draft. And of course, all of this is in the weekly checklist as well to remind you. So remember that policy that is always in place for the major papers. 10 points are deducted from your paper 2 grade if you do not upload your rough draft before that deadline. And as always, you want to go back, because I'll keep that open so that you can go back and see my comments. You need to give me a couple of days, maybe a little more, depending on how rough the grading is at that point with all 4 classes, to complete my comments, and I'll let you know when I'm done. But you want to go back and carefully read the comments I make, because on this paper, again, I will offer extensive feedback to you, including line editing. I will not do it anymore after paper 2. After paper 2, you'll be assuming more responsibility with papers 3 and 4 on your own for your writing. But I will offer you extensive feedback again on this paper. So you want to take advantage of that. You want to go in and look at my comments. It takes a lot of time to do it, and you need to do your part by then looking at the comments and enacting those suggestions into your final draft. Because for every suggestion I make that you don't enact, for every error I point out, those are going to be points that are deducted. So that final draft is due before 11:59 p.m. on Monday, the 7th of March. And again, you'll go to assignments and look for paper 2 final draft to submit. And remember the policy that is in place there, that's reiterated on the weekly checklist, in the syllabus, in the announcements, in emails. 10 points are deducted from your paper 2 grade for every calendar day that your paper is late. And that includes the day that it's due, and that includes weekends, should weekends fall within that date range. Papers are not accepted after 5 days because they would be Fs. So very important for you to remember that. The only exception to that policy is if you have received an official extension from me for a valid reason. So here are the specifics. This time your paper should be at least 2 1/2 pages in length. So you need a minimum of 2 1/2 pages of writing. If your paper is less than 2 1/2 pages, then you'll get points deducted. If you submit half a paper, you'll receive half a grade, which is a 50, which is an F. Obviously they're typed, they're double spaced. That's always protocol in college writing. Always, in every class you'll ever take in college, double space. Times New Roman 12-point font, standard margins. So for this assignment, you must use quotes and paraphrases, but most especially quotes from the text that you're analyzing, citing those quotes in MLA citation in the body of your paper, and that's called in-text or parenthetical citation. And then you must also cite this text on a separate works cited sheet, separate from the other pages. It's on its own page at the end of your paper. So you've got 2 1/2 pages of writing and then the separate works cited sheet. Don't put the works cited on the page where your paper ends, because that's incorrect. It needs to be on its own page. So here's the rhetorical situation, the situation to create effective communication. As a college student, you've been asked to write a rhetorical analysis. So you're going to break down the use of appeals and techniques, ethos, logos, pathos, and other techniques that you're seeing, like imagery, metaphor, simile, things like that. And your paper needs to conform to a formal academic structure. So you've got your introductory paragraph. You begin with your hook this time around, right? And then you've got the full name of the text, the author's full name in that intro, and then your thesis statement, which should appear as the very last sentence or two in paragraph 1. That's where it needs to be. If it's anywhere else, I'm going to tell you move it up to page 1, to the end of your intro. And then you need supporting paragraphs that provide the evidence for your thesis, for the idea you're setting forth in your thesis, and then a formal conclusion. So your audience, because remember, we tailor our writing based on who the audience is, right? And so based on what the exigency is. What's the purpose for the writing? Why does it matter at this moment in time? So your audience consists of your peers, your classmates, and me. This is an academic paper. So imagine we've read this chosen text before, and we have, because we're reading it together, right? But maybe pretend it might have been a while. So you might have to refresh our memories a little bit on certain things. That's a good sort of generalized way to look at college writing. And remember that this time, though, and this is so important, because if you miss this, you'll miss the focus of the paper. This is not an argumentative paper, okay? You are not agreeing or disagreeing with Sojourner Truth about women's rights. You're not doing that. You're not agreeing or disagreeing with Langston Hughes about whether or not young people should be pressured to go to the altar in church. It's not argumentative. You're not taking a position on that. Rather, you're offering a clear, persuasive analysis of the writing appeals and techniques that Hughes or Sojourner Truth is using, right? So you're not arguing anything. You're not agreeing with them. You're not disagreeing with them. You're saying Sojourner Truth used pathos here. Here's a technique she used well here. Langston Hughes used pathos here. And here's a technique he used, right? So that's the point. It's a rhetorical analysis. Make sure that you get that. So the point is to examine how one of these writers uses language to effectively communicate rhetoric, right? His or her purpose in order to reach the readers. So your concerns are with the how and the why of the text. So in other words, you're not simply restating or summarizing the author's message this time around, nor are you agreeing or disagreeing with the author's message. So it's not a summary. It's not an argumentative paper. Rather, you're uncovering more complex ways of understanding the components that author used to construct his or her message. So you want to notice every single appeal and technique that author is employing, every detail of the way in which that text is written and presented, and then you're going to formulate an intelligent, reasonable explanation for what all of this means. So for example, does the author use more logos than pathos, or more pathos than logos? So why might that be the case? Does the author employ a lot of descriptive language via metaphor or simile rather than just using a very straightforward style? Why? What's the effect? Does the author use humor? How? Why would this particular author choose to write a funny text as opposed to a serious one? Or maybe incorporate a little humor in the middle of a serious text? Why would that be? So to conduct a successful analysis paper, here are the questions you need to be thinking about as you're writing. What is the author's main message in this text? So what's the thesis? And there may not be a sentence that specifies the thesis. There may be, there may not be. And in Hughes's Salvation, for example, you're not going to find a sentence that probably states a thesis, because it's a story. It's not an article or something like that. But what is the message that's coming through? What rhetorical appeals used to create effective communication to the reader is that author using? Ethos. So how's the author setting himself or herself up to be credible and truthful and reliable to the reader? Logos, logic. What about that feels logical? Are there facts, statistics, data? You're probably not going to find that in either of these pieces because they're not articles. But there may be things within them that feel logical. And pathos, emotion. And you're going to find a lot of that in both of these pieces. What is causing the reader to feel emotion as the reader reads? So what appeals is the author using? How do they help to make this piece more effective? You want to quote the passages, and you want to explain how they're working. So if there's an absence of a particular appeal, or if there's more emphasis on one than another, why would the author have made that choice? So it might be because of audience. It might be because of who the writer is trying to reach, right? So why might Sojourner Truth choose to appeal with a lot of emotion to the people in that crowd? What rhetorical strategies or techniques is the author using? So maybe there's repetition. You might notice in Sojourner's piece the repetition of certain phrases, like, and ain't I a woman? Ain't I a woman? So that's repetition, and it is an example of a rhetorical question, a question that's meant to make us think. We're not necessarily going to say, well, yes, you are, right? But it's meant to be thought-provoking. Rhetorical questions, hyperbole, so over-exaggeration, metaphor, simile, personification, alliteration. What kinds of techniques are we seeing? So you want to quote the passages. You want to explain how they work. What about tone and style? So is the author using very formal, elevated language, or is it more just everyday language? And so are we seeing irony? Are we seeing humor, sarcasm? How are these elements working to communicate the message? And how might the target audience, the main audience to whom that message is directed, influence the author's choices? So with Sojourner Truth, who's the target audience? It would have been those people sitting at that women's rights convention back in the 1850s, right? And they're white. And most of them are women, but there are some men there as well. And not all of them are happy that she's there because she is a black former slave, and they feel they are above her, right? And some of them don't even want her to talk. So that's her target audience. Who's the target audience for Langston Hughes? Well, this piece, Salvation, comes from his autobiography, and that means a work that a writer writes about his or her own life, and that book was entitled The Big C. So this is a portion of that book. And so his target audience would have been readers who enjoy his work and who are going to buy his book, right? And so make sure that you're not confusing rhetorical techniques, also called strategies, with rhetorical appeals in your writing. Remember, there are only 3 appeals: ethos, logos, pathos, right? 3. But there are many, many, many techniques or strategies: alliteration, personification, metaphor, simile. You know, we could go on and on and on. What is the impact of the author's choices in terms of those rhetorical strategies and appeals? Are they effective in communicating the message or not, in your view? Who's the primary audience? So who's the target audience? And we just said that. Who's the secondary or invoked audience? So think about it. We're actually part of the secondary or invoked audience, because all these many years later, we're reading the works of these 2 great authors. Have you correctly cited your chosen text in MLA style, both in text, in the body of your paper, in parenthetical or in-text citations, and on that separate works cited page at the end of your paper? So you've got 2.5 pages of writing and then a separate page that your works cited information goes on. So here are some examples of possible intro thesis game plans for paper 2. And the first one uses Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman? Being both black and female during a time of unprecedented discrimination required a tremendous amount of courage and determination. However, openly speaking out against injustice while being a black woman in the 19th century demanded exponential bravery. Sojourner Truth, originally named Isabella Bonfrey, was a former slave who delivered an extraordinary speech excuse me, at the 1851 Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. A rhetorical analysis of her famous talk, entitled Ain't I a Woman, illustrates a masterful balance of ethos, logos, and pathos, in addition to techniques such as repetition and the use of rhetorical questions. So this author did a very, very good job. This author began with a hook, saying, you know what, if you were both black and a woman during a time of horrible discrimination against black people and women, it took a lot of courage and determination just to survive. But to openly speak out about all of that in the 19th century demanded just a huge amount of bravery. So that's a really interesting hook, because it makes the reader say, wonder who this person was. Wonder what this person's story is, this person who was both black and female, who openly spoke out. It intrigues the reader. And then, starting broadly like that, the writer narrows in a little more and tells us who the person was, Sojourner Truth, and her original name. And by the way, Bonfrey is sometimes spelled B-A-U-M, sometimes it's spelled B-O-M. And so I'll accept it either way, because we don't really know historically for sure which was the original correct spelling. And it tells us that she delivered the speech, when she delivered it, where she delivered it, and then we have the thesis, which gives us the title, and which gives us the main points: ethos, logos, pathos, and then techniques, repetition, rhetorical questions. So for this kind of thesis, you've got to offer proof through quotes from her speech of ethos, logos, and pathos, as well as repetition and rhetorical questions. Now here's an example for Salvation by Langston Hughes. As part of achieving maturity, many individuals have experienced the quest to determine for themselves whether to accept the religious beliefs upon which they were raised. In Langston Hughes' Salvation, a story from his autobiographical novel entitled The Big C, the author related such a journey as he recounts an old-fashioned revival he attended at age 12, in which he felt pressured to get saved. A rhetorical analysis of Hughes' memorable text reveals a pathos-driven narrative that also demonstrates ethos, as a young Hughes does not wish to lie about actually having seen Christ. Moreover, this story demonstrates the effective use of techniques such as realistic dialogue, imagery, and tone. So this writer has also done a really good job beginning broadly with that hook to which we can all relate, saying, you know what, as part of the growing up process, most of us, many individuals, notice the word people isn't used. It's individuals, which sounds a lot more elevated than people, have experienced the quest to determine for themselves whether or not they're going to go along with the religious beliefs of their parents, right, or however they were raised. And so starting broadly, everybody can relate to that, then narrowing in, giving us the writer's name, the title, correctly punctuated in quotation marks, because it's a short work. In Langston Hughes' Salvation, a story from his autobiographical novel entitled The Big C, there's a long work, a book, a novel, and it's italicized. The author related just this kind of journey, right? He's recounting this old-fashioned revival. So now we're learning who this person is, what he's recounting, and then we move to the thesis. So we learn this is a rhetorical analysis. We learn it's pathos-driven, so it's driven by emotion, but it's also demonstrating ethos because we see Hughes set up his reliability. He doesn't want to lie. That's why he doesn't go down to the altar, right? Because he doesn't want to lie. So there's a sense of morality and ethics within him that we're not going to see in Wesley, who is another character in this piece. And then we have a second line to the thesis that talks about techniques like realistic dialogue, imagery, and tone. So for that kind of thesis, you've got to offer evidence of your main points through quotes from Hughes' story, that the text is mainly reliant on pathos, emotion, to reach the reader. And you also need to include examples of ethos, how the writer is setting himself up to be credible, to be trustworthy to us as readers through his extreme sense of honesty and integrity. So he doesn't just rush down to the altar like Wesley, even though he knows that if he does, this will all be over and he can go home and eat lunch and relax. He doesn't do that because he hasn't literally seen Jesus, and that's what he expects, right? He feels like he's telling a lie to do that. And then also, if you notice, at the end of the piece, when you read it, Hughes is crying, and he's crying because he feels like he let people down, like he wasn't honest. So he has this sense of ethics within him. So finally, you also are going to have to include sections in your paper that demonstrate realistic dialogue. So the talking that's going on in the piece. So you might have a comment from the preacher or from Hughes's aunt or someone like that. The images that we're seeing in the piece. We get really realistic images of the church and of the people in the church. The tone. So for example, Hughes will use some lines that sound like a 12-year-old kid. So there's one section where he says, and my aunt said that when you get saved, you see a light, and Jesus comes, and this happens, and that happens, and an exclamation point at the end of all of that. So we're getting that voice of the young 12-year-old Hughes. But then there are other sections where we hear the mature Hughes, because Hughes writes this many, many years later as an adult, reflecting back on that experience as a 12-year-old. And so we hear that mature, poetic, writerly voice of the sophisticated, grown-up Langston Hughes, who became one of the most famous writers of the Harlem Renaissance. So think about, tone as well, and you would have to include that if you put that technique into your thesis. So those are the guidelines for paper 2. And as I say, we'll be engaging in a lot of activities in the discussion board that will really make a lot of these ideas more clear. You'll get to see some sample papers that will help you. And so best of luck to you in the paper, and I'll see you the next time.